The Ottoman Empire, at the height of its early power, sent two of its most capable sultans against the same city. The first blockaded it for 8 years, starved its population to the edge of collapse, and watched a crusade launched in the city's name shatter on his cavalry in a single afternoon. The second brought the empire's first cannon to its walls and assaulted them repeatedly through an entire summer. Neither man broke through. The city they failed to take would fall 30 years later to a third sultan who studied their failures with deliberate care. How Constantinople survived twice, and what those two failures taught the man who finally succeeded, is not a story about walls. It is a story about what lies behind them. To understand what Bayezid the Farce was attempting in 1394, it is necessary to understand what Constantinople had already become by that point. The empire bearing its name had been shrinking for over a century. The catastrophic sack of 1204, carried out not by a foreign enemy but by crusaders from the Latin West, had fractured Byzantine territory into competing successor states. The Palaiologos dynasty had restored the city in 1261, but the empire they recovered bore little resemblance to what had been lost. By the late 14th century, the territories nominally under Byzantine control had been reduced to a few scattered coastal strips, a peninsula in the Peloponnese called the Morea, and the city itself. Contemporary sources consistently describe an administration that could barely pay its garrison, a population diminished by plague and emigration, and a treasury that depended on the goodwill of Italian merchant republics to keep its sea lanes open. The physical city, however, remained formidable. The Theodosian land walls, constructed under Emperor Theodosius II in the early 5th century and substantially reinforced after an earthquake in 447, formed a triple line of defense stretching approximately 6 kilometers from the Sea of Marmara to the Golden Horn. Approaching from the open plain of Thrace, an attacker first faced a moat roughly 7 meters deep, then a low outer wall with a patrol track and crenellated parapet, then a higher intermediate wall with towers spaced at regular intervals, and finally the main inner wall rising to approximately 12 meters, topped by towers that stood another 6 to 8 meters above that. The total depth of this system, from the outer lip of the moat to the face of the inner wall, was on the order of 70 meters. Modern scholarship on military fortification consistently identifies the Theodosian walls as among the most sophisticated defensive structures of the ancient and medieval world. They had repelled Arab forces in 674, 678, and 717. They had held against the Avars, the Bulgars, and repeated internal challengers. Attacker after attacker had broken against them for nearly 1,000 years. What Bayezid the Farce understood, and what his successors would also understand, was that the walls could not be taken by direct assault with the technology then available. The city would have to be made to surrender. Bayezid Val came to the Ottoman throne in 1389 following the death of his father Murad Val at the Battle of Kosovo. He had already spent years observing Byzantine weakness from close proximity, having required Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, who would later become the defender of the besieged city, to serve as a vassal on Ottoman campaigns in Anatolia. Contemporary sources record that this relationship was corrosive. The emperor of one of the oldest Christian dynasties in the world was required to accompany the Sultan as a subordinate to watch Byzantine-held Philadelphia, the last Roman outpost in Asia Minor, fall to Ottoman forces, and to participate in discussions about the nature of Islam with scholars in the Sultan's court. By 1391, when Manuel II secured the throne in Constantinople following the death of his father, the Ottoman position in the Balkans had already cut the city off from its hinterland. Bayezid constructed the fortress of Anadoluhisari on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus to monitor and restrict sea traffic. By 1394, a near-contemporary chronicle records all land routes into the city had been effectively closed. The strategy Bayezid employed was starvation. It was not an improvised response to the wall's resilience. Modern scholarship on the siege, including detailed work on its repercussions for the city's civilian population published in the 1980s, identifies starvation as Bayezid's deliberate and practiced method, one he had already applied successfully against Greek cities in Anatolia before turning it on Constantinople. The city's gates, according to a commemorative oration written shortly after the siege ended by the Byzantine scholar Demetrios Chrysoloras, remained closed for most of the 8-year blockade. Emperor Manuel II appealed to Venice for grain 3 times between 1394 and 1396. The Senate responded on each occasion, but the shipments that did reach the city, grain cargoes of several hundred tons annually, were small relative to the population's needs, and it remains uncertain how many reached port past the Ottoman vessels patrolling the harbor entrance. Contemporary accounts consistently describe outbreaks of famine, followed by plague, followed by flight. A letter written by the Byzantine scholar Manuel Kalakis in the fall of 1398, one of a number of near-contemporary private documents that survive from this period, describes the population of Constantinople as worn out by poverty and famine, the city itself resembling, in his phrase, a widow left behind. There was one moment during these 8 years when the city received meaningful external assistance. In 1396, the Crusade of Nicopolis, a coalition force drawn primarily from France, Hungary, Germany, and other Western powers, assembled specifically to relieve Constantinople, marched south toward the Ottoman lines. It was, as modern historians note, the last large-scale organized crusade of the medieval period. Pope Boniface IX had called for the expedition in 1394. The King of Hungary, Sigismund of Luxembourg, organized and led it. Manuel II Palaiologos contributed 10 ships to the effort from inside the blockade. Bayezid turned from Constantinople to meet the crusading column at Nicopolis on September 25, 1396. The result was decided in a single afternoon. French and Burgundian heavy cavalry, acting without coordination with their Hungarian allies, charged the Ottoman lines ahead of any organized plan. Contemporary accounts from both sides describe the advance as breaking against prepared Ottoman infantry and then being struck by reserve cavalry from the flanks. Casualties on the crusading side were severe. The number of prisoners was large enough that Bayezid reportedly could not ransom them all. Contemporary sources range widely in their figures for both sides, as they do for most medieval engagements, and modern historians have not arrived at a consensus on total losses. What is certain is that the Crusade of Nicopolis did not relieve Constantinople, and that Bayezid returned to the blockade with his position stronger than when he had left it. The city inside the walls had gained nothing. The food reserves that contemporary letters describe as already stretched thin continued to diminish. But there was one variable in Bayezid's strategic situation that no siege plan could account for, and it was approaching from the east. Here was the single factor that would decide whether Constantinople survived the first Ottoman siege, and it had nothing to do with the city's walls, its defenders, or its emperor. Timur, ruler of the Timurid Empire and one of the most capable field commanders of the late medieval world, had been building a confrontation with Bayezid for years over control of Anatolian principalities and the loyalty of their rulers. In the summer of 1402, Timur's army advanced into the heart of Anatolia. Bayezid, who had been pressing the blockade of Constantinople, was compelled to lift it and march his forces east through the summer heat to meet the threat. Modern accounts of what followed at the Battle of Ankara on July 28, 1402, note that Bayezid's troops arrived exhausted and thirsty after the march, that Timur had outmaneuvered him strategically before the battle even began, and that a significant portion of Bayezid's Anatolian vassals defected to the Timurid side during the fighting. Bayezid was captured, the only Ottoman sultan in the dynasty's history to be taken prisoner by an enemy in battle. He died in captivity in 1403. Constantinople had survived the first siege not because its walls broke the Ottoman advance, but because another empire broke the man directing it. The aftermath was significant. The Treaty of Gallipoli, negotiated in February 1403 between Bayezid's son Suleiman and the Byzantine court, returned to Constantinople control of Thessalonica, the Chalkidike Peninsula, and several fortresses in Macedonia and Thrace, while suspending the annual tribute the empire had been paying. It was the most substantial territorial recovery Byzantine diplomacy had achieved in decades, but the underlying arithmetic had not changed. The city that had survived was still an enclave. The walls that had held were still holding against an enemy that would eventually find a way around them. What Manuel II Palaeologos had done during the 8-year siege illuminates just how close to collapse the city had come. In December 1399, with the blockade in its 5th year and no relief force in prospect, the emperor entrusted his capital to his recently reconciled nephew John VII and sailed from Constantinople with Marshal Boucicaut, the French commander who had arrived earlier that year with a small expeditionary force. Manuel's subsequent journey was without precedent. A Roman emperor traveling through Venice, Milan, Paris, and London, the last no Roman emperor had visited, to beg personally for military assistance. A French chronicler who recorded the Paris meeting noted the formality of the encounter and the honors paid to the emperor, though the actual pledges of military support he received, as his own letters from the period acknowledge, did not match the ceremonial warmth of his reception. By spring 1402, Manuel, then in France, was already preparing to return home with less than he had hoped. The Battle of Ankara, which he had not planned for and could not have arranged, was what made his return possible on favorable terms. The Ottoman interregnum that followed Bayezid's defeat lasted until 1413, when Mehmed I consolidated control. Manuel maintained a functional relationship with Mehmed I throughout this period, but when Mehmed I died in 1421 and his son Murad II emerged from a contested succession as the new sultan, Manuel made a calculation that his own sources and later historians record as a serious miscalculation. He attempted to support a rival claimant to the Ottoman throne to weaken Murad's position. This was the same strategic tool the Byzantines had used against their neighbors for generations. It had worked before. This time, it did not. Murad II responded by revoking all the privileges the Byzantines had secured in the previous 2 decades and marching on Constantinople. The siege he initiated in the summer of 1422 was qualitatively different from Bayezid's blockade. Murad brought siege equipment and, according to sources including Stephen Turnbull's modern analysis of the walls, the first cannon the Ottomans had deployed against Constantinople, described in contemporary accounts as short, wide weapons of the type called falcons. The Theodosian walls, which had never faced gunpowder artillery in their history, were now doing so for the first time. The technology was still early. Both sides had comparable capability in this area, and contemporary accounts note that the Ottomans also had to construct barricades to protect their own positions from Byzantine bombardment. But the fact that cannon had appeared before the walls mattered as an indicator of what was coming. Murad launched repeated infantry assaults through the summer months. The Chronicle of John Cananos, one of the closest contemporary accounts of the 1422 siege, records that the defenders, depleted in numbers, facing an enemy that modern scholarship regards as substantially larger though precise figures are not preserved in reliable form, held the outer works through repeated attacks. The Theodosian walls in 1422 were still the walls that had stood for 1,000 years, but the garrison defending them was not the garrison of earlier centuries. Contemporary sources record that the Byzantine Empire at this point could field only a small fraction of the soldiers a city of this size and wall length required. The defenders held sections concentrated where the pressure was greatest and left other stretches thinly covered. That the outer walls held at all against an Ottoman force equipped with artillery and deploying sustained infantry assault is a detail that modern historians of Byzantine fortification regard as a testament to the structural engineering of the 5th century builders rather than to the military strength of the 15th century defenders. The Chronicle of John Cananos records a moment during the assault when the Byzantine garrison, exhausted from weeks of continuous defense, reported seeing a figure in purple robes on the outer ramparts. Cananos writes that this vision was understood by the defenders as a sign of divine protection and that it produced a renewal of their resistance. The Ottoman side, according to the same account, also perceived the apparition. Byzantine tradition identified the figure as the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, in keeping with the city's long history of attributing its survival to supernatural intercession. What the historical record preserves is not the vision itself, but the recorded effect it had on both sides. The siege ended on September 6, 1422. Not because the walls had broken, not because the defenders had surrendered, but because Murad's younger brother Küçük Mustafa, supported by the Anatolian beyliks of Karaman and Germian, and according to the Byzantine historian Dukas, financed in part by Byzantine gold, had launched a rebellion in Anatolia and besieged the Ottoman capital of Bursa. Murad faced the same structural problem Bayezid had faced 20 years earlier. His empire's power was divided by the Bosphorus, and a threat on one side required withdrawing forces from the other. He lifted the siege and marched east. Constantinople had survived the Second Ottoman siege on exactly the same terms as the first, not through military victory, but because something external to the city forced the attacker to leave. The consequences of 1422 were grimmer in a different way than those of 1402. There was no new treaty of equivalent value, no territorial recovery. Contemporary sources record that the Byzantine Empire at this point had been reduced to a few disconnected strips of land besides the city itself, that it faced grave economic problems, and that its military capacity was effectively exhausted. Any new cannon the city received after 1422 came as gifts from European states. The empire had no domestic capacity to produce the weapons it had just successfully used in its own defense. What the city had demonstrated, that its walls could hold against Ottoman assault even with early artillery, was simultaneously a real achievement and a revelation of the terms on which the next siege would have to be fought. A sultan who studied what had failed would understand that the walls required heavier guns, longer preparation, a garrison too small to resist at all points, and no convenient external disaster to save the defenders. Mehmed II was 21 years old when he came to the Ottoman throne in 1451. Contemporary sources record that he had studied the failures of his predecessors with deliberate attention, that he had ordered his engineers to improve the roads and bridges leading to Constantinople so they could support larger cannon than any previously built, and that he had commissioned the Hungarian engineer Orban specifically to design weapons capable of breaching the Theodosian walls. He built the fortress of Rumeli Hisari on the European shore of the Bosphorus in 1452, directly across from the Anadolu Hisari Bayezid I had built more than half a century earlier, giving him complete control of the strait and cutting off any seaborne relief. He began his siege on April 6, 1453. It lasted 53 days. Manuel II Palaiologos, who had outlasted Bayezid I's siege and lived to see Murad II's siege fail, did not live to see 1453. He died on July 21, 1425, at approximately 75 years of age, in Constantinople, the city he had defended, abandoned briefly to beg for help in foreign courts, and returned to govern for another 2 decades. The historian George Francis, who had served in the imperial court and took down the emperor's final dictation, records that Manuel voiced concerns near the end about the defensibility of what he was leaving behind. He was buried in the Pantocrator monastery. The walls that had held twice in his lifetime would not hold a third time. The 2 sieges that failed left behind something more consequential than the survival of a city. They left behind a precise record of what it would take to finish the task. The gates that had stayed closed, the garrison that had held the outer ramparts, the Theotokos seen walking the walls, none of it had been enough to secure the future. It had only been enough to survive until the next sultan arrived who had studied the lesson correctly. This was Imperion Archive, where the past still rides.